Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC TV show podcast brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Priscilla Welch. Happy Thursday. We are here in another week. I hope it goes well for all of you listening out there. Stay tuned in the show and I'll be releasing new updates on the smash hit on Starz, The Spanish Princess. Today is all about history, facts, and monarchs. So, for those of you out there who are fans of England and France and Italy, Scotland, Ireland, especially during the times of war, especially like way back then, like back in the day when things were still happening between the monarchs and the countries. Of course, we sometimes see that with political situations that things still occur even now. But I find very interesting how even in school, like we learn so much about the English monarchs because before America was really American established, the Pilgrims came over from England. So a lot of times with American history, a lot of our development with English as the language was taken from, of course, England. So it's very interesting how sometimes even if you look at your media, we still reflect somehow and we still focus on what's going on in England with the current Queen Elizabeth and her family. So one of my favorite things to talk about is the English royals and monarchs. They have so many TV shows out there and they've done so many different movies, especially of like the Virgin Queen, for example, Queen Elizabeth. So what I've noticed though, a lot of times they focus on a certain part of English history. And so that's what I want to talk to you guys about today of basically my research that I have done over the years and the family bloodlines, especially that leads up to the current Queen Elizabeth II that's currently living right now, the current living monarch. And she's the one of the longest actually living monarchs that we have in this world today. So she actually backtracks all the way to, she is related to, she's a descendant of the York name, the York family, for those of you who did not know that. So I actually will be starting off basically with the York and Lancaster names, and then we'll get into later on the Tudor family, which is really a big monarch as well, which is where the Virgin Queen is actually from. She was actually the last living monarch of the Tudor name. So, of course, we have to start off with the one and only, the White Queen. The White Queen is the first show that actually, not the first one was actually the Tudors, which we'll talk about later in the show. But the White Queen actually brings a whole new light because it's like the prequel that you should watch so that we have a better understanding of the War of Roses. Okay. So just a little backstory. First of all, as I discussed before, today is all about the Tudors bloodline. So all the TV shows related to the story will be discussed in the order it should be watched, even though it didn't come out in that order. So we will start with the prequels. So a little bit of backstory. Again, The White Queen, you can watch it on Starz. There's only one season because after this, we will go into The White Princess. And The White Princess is basically the daughter of the White Queen. So Queen Elizabeth of Woodville, she was actually married to King Edward IV. This is actually her second husband, okay? So the shows actually were based on novels by Philippa Gregory. And it's not an autobiography. That's what people have to remember, because it's not like they were there back in those times to actually get like more evidence of what they could come up with currently now and for this era. But they were able to scrap stuff from like research and throughout history and throughout timelines. And of course, through like families as well, probably living in England that are related to these people that died so many years ago. So her family came from middle class. We know that. And her first husband was actually Sir John Grey of Gobi. He actually died at the Second Battle of St. Albans. And he is part of House of Lancaster. So keep that in mind. She was then widowed, of course, and then she had 2 sons with him. Then her second husband came along, and he was the first king since the Norman conquest. And if you are familiar with that in history, it's basically about William the Conqueror during the 11th century. Then we have she was the first consort to be queen. So she was able to also help her siblings and her family with her status when she became queen. And of course, her enemies were Richard Neville and Earl of Warwick, which at the time was the kingmaker. And he was on the side of King Edward. He actually helped King Edward IV become king. Then we have Elizabeth's father, which also is demonstrated a lot of these facts that I'm staying out in the show. So like, of course, with any TV show, especially based on real events of history, we have things that were accurate and things that were inaccurate. So I'll talk about that today as well. And Elizabeth's father, he was executed because of the war between her husband and the Earl, Warwick. Because he eventually, and they demonstrate this over the show, went over to the Lancastrian side when he realized he couldn't get his way. A lot of times, if you notice, when you watch any documentary or watch any show or movie, when it comes to the English monarchs or anything with Scotland, Ireland, France, Spain even too, everything is always revolved around the Catholic faith, around the Catholic Church. Then, of course, if somebody decides to rebel, however, then, like, for example, Henry VIII, we will also talk about later, he literally rebelled and wanted to do this whole thing with the Church of England and, but we'll get into that later. So, of course, now, it's like a whole bunch of crossfire. And the reason why it's called War of Roses is because House York is the white rose. And then we have the Lancasters and the Tudors, which is the red rose. Her brother-in-law, Richard, he actually took the place over the son that she had, because after King Edward dies, which they also show in the show, of course, naturally it's supposed to go to their sons, and then maybe the queen will be regent or whoever is next to be regent in that bloodline. Until, of course, the son will come of age to be properly, who is properly mature to actually take over an entire country and whatever other properties at that time that England owned. So her brother-in-law, Richard, he took the place over, which is actually King Edward's brother. And then Edward and Richard, after that, the sons, they actually disappeared and are presumed dead. This is where I believe also too, this is where it's considered the York Boys in the Tower. There's so many stories about that because of the horror and the true events that happened. They actually later get killed. So then moving along, her daughter Elizabeth is the White Princess, and she will later marry on Henry VII, and we'll get into that later. Again, they are also the parents of Henry, the famous Henry VIII, the one with more than 4 wives, okay? And Elizabeth Woodville, of course, is the grandmother of Henry VIII. So here are some accurate and inaccurate things that happened on the show from what I remember. And I also did my research on this, so for those of you out there who are listening, the accuracy actually was Warwick helping Henry IV, as I mentioned, during the War of Roses. As Elizabeth Woodville's beauty, her kind relation, the kind relation with the widows that Henry IV had was actually true as well. And the king and queen. So Elizabeth Woodville and King Henry, they actually were married in secret. That's something that they did get accurate on the show. So some inaccuracies are how the queen is portrayed as a witch. Now, no one knows for sure what exactly happened, back in that time. There was a lot of different things going on that we know throughout history, even with Salem witch trials, for example. That was actually inaccurate. We don't have true evidence. And then the costuming was actually inaccurate as well for the show. For example, zippers were being shown, the corduroys were being shown that they wear on their heads. Hairstyles, they weren't supposed to have hairstyles actually down. A lot of times to differentiate amongst who was high class among women, especially in the royal court, the woman will have the hair up. And the queen will be really the only one that is allowed to have her hair down. So they actually did get that inaccurate on the TV show. The setting of the show was also too clean. I understand England is like one of those beautiful countries, but back then, especially when it comes to like sicknesses, diseases, and stuff like that, it's very inaccurate to have it on a TV show that it looks super, super clean and there's like no mess in the streets at all. And also, Anne Neville's character, which is the daughter of Warwick, the Kingmaker, her portrayal of her character on the TV show is also inaccurate. She was queen briefly. They did get that part accurate. But being portrayed, whether as that's significant, there's not a lot of evidence out there. So she was kind of like a minor supporting role, especially in real life. And also, last but not least, the queen, the way she's portrayed as just this good, beautiful woman. Well, a lot of times people have to remember, no matter what in politics or in monarchs, especially when you're king and queen, you can still be conniving and doing plots and coys and all these different things. So the way that she was actually portrayed in the show, they actually said in real life, she was a little bit like diminishing and manipulating, and she had secrets of her own. She was very, very secretive. So not really accurate on that part. So as I said before, you can actually watch the TV show on Stars, and I recommend watching this first so you have a better understanding of what happened before the Tudor bloodline was really set in place. And of course, War of Roses is accurate. That really did happen in real life. It is one of the bloodiest wars in English history. And again, it's the war between the Lancasters and the York family. And this is very important because I feel like history really reflects a lot of what we repeat a lot throughout the timeline as humans. The monarchs in England, they literally have been long going for the longest. They're one of those nations, those countries that still kept kings and queens, that still kept that old tradition. And again, this is a very important topic because it reflects as well to the current Queen of England that we have, who, like I said before, is a descendant from the House of York. So some of the detailed cast is Rebecca Ferguson, who plays the Queen. We have Max Irons, who plays the King, Aneurin Barnard, who plays Richard, Duke of York, James Frayne, Richard Neville, David Oakes, George, Duke of York, Tom McKay, who plays Jasper Tudor, he's very important, Freya Mavor, who is Elizabeth of York, who later will be called the White Princess. But there's different cast, of course, for the White Princess afterwards. I feel like you should watch the show. Again, if you are into history, if you love learning about England back in its day, England is a very interesting topic to talk about. There's always some type of betrayal and violence going on just for people to secure the throne. And at the time where this was happening in England, King Louis was helping King Edward end the 100-Year War and rebelled against even his own father. And he is known as the cunning and the prudent, if you know him from history. He also expanded France's power, strengthened the economy, and married Charlotte of Savoy in Italy. So he actually was able to build a connection with Italy as well because of his wife, King Louis. And that's where there started the French involvement in Italy as well. In Scotland, this is where King Edward actually invaded by sea and land. So at this point in time, during the 11th century, England and Scotland weren't really on good terms right now. So let's see how that changes. So, of course, there's no season 2 because the story again steps into the White Princess, the daughter's life. The daughter who is called Elizabeth of York, and she's the daughter of King Edward IV, Elizabeth Woodville. And this is where, when we get into the White Princess, that the reign of the Tudors will actually begin. In total, King Edward IV and the White Queen had 10 children, but Elizabeth is known to be the fairest of them all. She takes after her mother. So yeah, that's pretty much it so far for the White Queen. Again, so coming up after the break, we will get into the White Princess, which you could also watch on Stars. Stay tuned.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. Keith keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back from the break, everyone. So if you're now tuning in with us, again, today is all about history, monarchs, and facts, and of course, England. Again, we started off the show with talking about The White Queen, which you can watch on Starz, the first season. I'm not sure if you can really watch it anywhere else. I do know Starz, as long as you have a subscription, you can watch these shows. So now we're going to get into The White Princess, which basically is a completely different cast from The White Queen, but it's literally what happens right after, if you've watched the show or if you're about to watch the show. So it's right after the next. And we're going to talk about today basically the inaccuracy versus the accuracy based off the show. So basically, again, The White Princess, it's all about the daughter, Elizabeth of York. She's the daughter of King Edward IV and the White Queen, Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth of York deals with, of course, the aftermath. In the show, this is actually inaccurate of her relationship between her uncle Richard, who tried to take the throne. And this was very, very inaccurate because this is incest. Not saying incest did not exist, especially throughout the ages, throughout the monarchs, among many different countries. But this was inaccurate on the show. But then her sister was supposed to, they were saying that her sister was supposed to actually marry King Henry VII. Now, the way King Henry VII comes into play against the York family was actually through Lady Margaret Beaufort. She actually was in The White Queen, her character, and she was actually a lady in waiting. King Henry and his uncle Jasper Tudor, they actually were on the run for like so many years based on in The White Queen because of what happened back before with the war with the Lancastrian families. And so basically King Henry VII, he becomes king because he basically defeated his enemies and won the war. And of course his mother had a big hand in that, of putting her son to be king. The way they did it in the show was so funny. Like the actress that played her, it was like, I know my son is supposed to be king and nobody else. He's the true king. So this is where, of course, again, King Henry VII is also Lancastrian family, but he's also Tudor, because of his uncle's bloodline as well. So again, Elizabeth of York's brothers at this point, they should have been next in line, but she basically married kind of the enemy, I want to say. At first, they weren't too thrilled about their marriage, but they had actually a pretty good marriage, the two of them. It was actually 17 long years. And there is evidence that shows proof that King Henry VII, regardless of everything, actually treated her as a good wife. So they were dethroned, her brothers, and the two youngest were killed, which is going back to the young boys in the tower. There's actually a few books out there and a couple of different plays and TV shows that actually reflect back on that because of how long they were imprisoned and the fact that because of King Henry VII's paranoia, they were killed. And again, like I said, they're called the Boys in the Tower. Again, this is a battle between the York family and the Lancasters, but also / Tudors anyway. So yeah, she ends up marrying King Henry VII. Jasper Tudor is actually the uncle of King Henry VII. And this is about the family finally coming together, the white and the red rose. The white basically is being consumed by the red because, of course, the king is above the queen. The Battle of Bosworth Field, this actually ends the war amongst the two families because after this war, they actually get married right after. Elizabeth of York is known as the fairest of Edward's offspring, which was mentioned earlier as well. Again, both were married for 17 years and had 7 kids. She actually dies in childbirth, unfortunately, giving up her last child. And King Henry VII, throughout his lifetime, this was accurate, that he was paranoid and he killed Teddy. Teddy was known as Elizabeth of York's younger cousin and the younger brother to Margaret Pole, which is displayed on the TV show as well. And he was a York boy. That's what he was known for. And he was also in prison most of his life in the Tower of London until finally there were, I guess, people protesting and saying things like he's the true king and we will support him. We don't care about this King Henry VII. He's a legitimate heir. And this paranoid King Henry VII so much that he literally killed, very devastating, and it is something that accurately happened. So during this time in France, Mary Tudor, which is actually the daughter of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, she actually marries King of France, Louis XII. In Spain, we have the current Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. They are also the parents of Katherine of Aragon, which is what we're going to talk about more later in the show, that is in regards to the Spanish princess. Because Katherine of Aragon is the first wife of the future queen. She's the first queen, and she's the first wife to King Henry VIII, which again is the son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. And he is the brother to Mary Tudor. And then in Scotland, Margaret becomes Queen of Scots. She is also another daughter of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. So again, the show, it reflects different cast. It has the same story. You can watch this on Stars. And my opinion of the show altogether, I feel like was pretty well written. I feel it was a lot of drama, a lot of violence, and they kind of stuck to what happened in true events. However, the Queen, for example, this is one thing that wasn't accurate. Again, I did my research. Showing a lot of cleavage, with their costuming and their dresses that they wore. That's something the Queen would have never done and never did, actually. So again, I feel like going back, it's important to know your history. Again, it may not be our history in particular, depending on what your bloodline is and where you come from. But I find it very cool to see what happens with kings and queens and how everyone is connected. I feel like it's amazing how the current Queen of England, again, one of the longest living monarchs, she's lived through so much. Again, she is a descendant from the family of York. So it's kind of cool to see how certain families and even monarchs could backtrack to where they come from. A lot of people, I feel do not get the same blessing because of immigration and slavery and and things like that. So they're not able to really backtrack to where they come from because a lot of times things get mixed up and families don't really know their history. So it's kind of if your parents don't know your history and their parents didn't know their history, your history ends up getting lost. So I always admired how the English, the French, and Spain, a lot of these monarchs and these families and these royal families, or even if you were just middle class, if you were dukes or duchesses or princes and princesses, they're able to backtrack and know who their ancestors were. It's amazing. So at the time, also during Ireland, King Henry VII was actually Lord of Ireland. Not king, but he still ruled over Ireland at this point in time. Again, different cast, the same story. It's relatable to Queen Elizabeth of this era, and it jumps into King Henry VIII's story. So the way it goes is actually the Spanish princess you would watch that before you would watch the Tudors. Now, some of you may know what the Tudors is. It's actually a show that came out back in 2012, 2013, many years before, and we'll get into that right after The White Princess. The show, Spanish Princess, is the prequel. So this is actually what happens after The White Princess. I would recommend you watch The White Queen, The White Princess, then you will watch The Spanish Princess, then you'll watch Henry VIII for the Tudors. It's just called the Tudors. That's it. During the Tudors, that's when we see he's grown and he's already starting this whole thing that happened between him and his first wife. At that point in time, he has his daughter Mary, which is also known as Bloody Mary, but we'll get into that later. At this time, too, the country was turned into Protestant during King Henry VIII's reign. So there's a lot to talk about involving him. But I think it's very important, of course, to understand where he comes from, because his parents would have never done anything like that, and they were still part of the church. So I think that's pretty cool. So again, what I find interesting is how King Henry VII's paranoia was, because throughout the show, like, it really irked my soul how the things that you had to do, like, I can only imagine where if you were in Elizabeth of York's shoes, her mother was just the queen. And then the way they described it in the show, like, at least in The White Princess, it's so fast. As soon as you don't have a husband anymore as a woman in this role, or as soon as you don't have any male heirs, you're automatically just forgotten about. And it's like, wait a minute, I was just queen. I was just ruling this place, though. So it's like the fact that her daughter was able to still secure everything was amazing. But in the show, the mother actually didn't want to, she actually wanted to make sure, like, her daughter kind of had the power still, even though her husband was the true ruler. And at the same time, she still tried to, like, plot against them. Now, I'm not sure about that part of the show, if that's inaccurate or accurate. I would assume stuff like that obviously happened, because whenever it comes to monarchs, like, there's always some type of ploy thing going on. And however, she had to take her husband's side, because if she didn't, she could have been killed herself. And then whatever children that she had with him, they would have been put out as illegitimate, and then it would have went back to her brothers being the true kings or queens or princesses or whatever the case may be. It's very complicated. It's one of those situations, I feel like, where you have to choose your marriage over your actual, like, bloodline where you came from, because you're creating a whole new bloodline. And it's very interesting how everything's connected, because basically for her husband to become king, her family, the York family, had to suffer in order for, again, this is going back to the War of Roses. Like, literally, the red rose is consuming the white one. And she's the one that's literally being consumed. She's the rose. So, and her whole family. And in the show, her mom and her, they did not see eye to eye until her mom eventually died. And it was too late. So, and then, of course, her brothers as well. It's very interesting. And it's very interesting as well as to how far a mother would go to make sure that her son also becomes the king. And this is going back to Lady Margaret, because the way her character was depicted in The White Queen, you knew she had some motives, but the way everything was between her and the White Queen, you wouldn't think that would have happened until finally, like, basically it was like everyone against somebody. So very interesting to look at. And Lady Margaret, I admire her, even though I don't like the way her character was depicted, because she's supposed to be like the bad guy, I want to say, but like, if it depends on how you look at it, like your perspective. And she literally had a lot to play it. Even when King Henry VIII was becoming king, he kind of like got along a lot, at least in the show, with his grandmother, because she knew how to influence, especially when it came to like her faith and everything like that. So again, very, very interesting show to watch. And coming up after the break, we'll finally get into King Henry VIII. He is known for his romances, and I can't wait to talk about his wives with you all. So stay tuned after the show. Thank you.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, everyone. So we're halfway through the show. Welcome back from the break. Again, so I've been teasing this all day. We're going to get into our last two shows here today. So first up, we have The Tudors. If you're now tuning in, we just finished discussing The White Queen. And before that, we were discussing The White Princess. And those are the two shows that you're definitely going to want to watch before you watch The Tudors, because The Tudors will be the last show that you would watch. But the way, again, I will repeat it, it is The White Queen that you watch first, then The White Princess, then The Spanish Princess, and then The Tudors. But, however, The Spanish Princess, I want to leave for last for you all, because there's still a season 2 that will be coming out very, very shortly. So stay tuned for that news and that update. So The Tudors, finally, we're getting into it. So after watching The White Queen and The White Princess, you will have a better understanding of who King Henry VIII is. Now, again, this is relatable to the current Queen Elizabeth that we have right now. Now, the country at this point of King Henry VIII has turned Protestant. It's basically moving away from Catholicism. And he started this whole thing with the Church of England because of his first wife, who he tried to annul their marriage, which is of Queen Katherine of Aragon. She's from Spain, a part of Spain. And his daughters is actually with Mary, which is also known as Bloody Mary later on, because when she becomes queen for her brief reign, she actually tries to take back what her father did during his reign. He reigned for a very long time. And at this point, she wanted to turn it back to Catholicism. And the only reason why, honestly, the way it started, again, he wanted a divorce from the first queen, Catherine, and he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. But even right before he got into Anne Boleyn, which is also in the show, he was actually with another mistress who he had an illegitimate son with, who is known as Henry Fitzroy. And then, of course, King Henry VIII is the father to Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, the famous red-haired Queen Elizabeth, who eventually rules by herself. But she was always mad at her father for killing her mother, Anne Boleyn, who was the second wife to him. So starting off for us is Catherine of Aragon, which is what the Spanish Princess is all about, and is the first wife of King Henry VIII. She was actually demoted, and she did not bear a son at all. Again, going back to her only child with him was Mary, aka Bloody Mary in the future. Then we have Bessie, which is one of the ladies in waiting for Catherine of Aragon, and she bore a son for him, but he was illegitimate because, again, ladies in waiting, not royal, and he gained the name Henry Fitzroy, which I assume he took his mother's last name, since he couldn't take, obviously, Henry Tudor. And again, we all know how that is where it comes to illegitimacy, and how mothers and fathers have tried so much to put their illegitimate son or daughter on the throne. Then we have Anne Boleyn. She was actually beheaded, and you may have heard of her story, and her sisters, actually. It's called The Other Boleyn Girl. And the way that movie was portrayed was, first, Anne did not get King Henry VIII at first. It was actually her sister. And her sister and King Henry had a illegitimate son. But that was specifically for the movie. True evidence that shows that they had another son. He had another son that was illegitimate with her. But if you watch that movie, it also stars Scarlett Johansson in that movie as well, who played the sister to Anne. With her, she actually was beheaded, like I said before, because she was accused of adultery and treason, and King Henry annulled their marriage. And again, the whole reason why it started in the first place for him to start the Church of England, because he wanted to decide who he wanted to marry, who he wanted to divorce. And the whole reason back to why he did it to Catherine of Aragon was because she was actually married to his older brother way before they even got married. And this was like when they were back at like 17, 19 years old. And she was married to the Prince of Wales. Apparently, they never consummated their marriage, at least from her point of view. and which meaning they never had sex. And of course, you had to have sex the very first night of your marriage to actually consummate it, because if you did, that means you were officially a married couple. If you didn't have sex at all, especially if the woman was a virgin before, didn't matter if the man was a virgin or not, but if the woman was a virgin before, then that meant something, because then she had to start becoming pregnant, producing male heirs. Her first husband, like I said, he died five months later within that first year of marriage. And there was a whole plot and everything, and she went after basically King Henry VIII instead. He wanted her too, so it was kind of two-sided. And I love how the show, actually, we'll get more into that later, kind of portrays that as well. Then we have Jane Seymour. She was actually just married like 4 days to King Henry VIII right after Anne Boleyn's execution, and she actually served as lady-in-waiting to both queens, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Very tricky. And she birthed Edward VI. Very cool. She was buried also next to King Henry VIII, because now they finally had a wife that actually he put in royal stature, and she bore a son for him, but she died in childbirth like right after, when the baby was still an infant. Basically, he looked at it as like the only one that really gave him what he wanted, and that is why she was able to be buried next to the chapel next to King Henry VIII. Then, of course, after she died, he was looking for another queen again, and we have Anne of Cleves. This is where he was actually pressured in his time of reign to actually have or take on another wife. And Anne of Cleves was actually considered an ugly wife. She was German. As soon as they were about to be in the process of the wedding, he tried to stop it midway, and he divorced her after 6 months. And they used to call her as a nickname the King's Sister, because they were no longer married, but she still had some type of status. And she actually died in peace. He actually paid her off and everything. So she actually did a win-win here. She didn't have to deal with him at all. Then we have Catherine Howard, who was another lady-in-waiting, and she was lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves. You can see the pattern here. At this point in time, Henry was a bit overweight and a bit older, and Catherine Howard was actually only 19 years old. She was actually accused of adultery, even though she was showered with gifts from King Henry VIII. I would assume, if based off the evidence at this point, remember, she's still a kid. She's only 19 years old, and this is an older man. So she probably wasn't attracted to him, which is why he showered her so much with gifts to kind of keep his wife happy. But she probably went ahead and pursued other men. But again, this is just his accusations. We don't know for sure if she actually did cheat on him. And then finally, we have Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr, honestly, I admire her the most, because she was really, based off history and timelines, she was really the only wife that actually was able to basically influence the King Henry. And what I'm saying is, basically, she was interested in Protestantism, and she was influenced on the culture, the religion, the education of King Henry's children, and the role of women throughout the time. And she also, too, played regent when King Henry actually goes to war in France, which is also depicted in the TV show. And she restored the succession of his daughters. Here's the crazy thing that King Henry VIII did. Even though he had daughters, he never really respected them as women. He kind of took away their status to basically ascend the throne in case anything was to happen to him, because they weren't boys. I mean, at the time, of course, for their culture, it made sense to them. Of course, now if you were to do something like that, we all gonna look at you like, what? I'm your blood too. What's up with that? And I can do anything a man can do. So actually, she died a year later after King Henry died. But like I said, she is one of the most inspiring ones out of all his wives. Every wife had a part to play. Jane Seymour was the one that finally bore him a legitimate son, because she literally did become queen and was his wife. Unlike the previous one that was more just his mistress. And then Catherine of Aragon was the only one he really actually loved, and she gave him his first child, which is Bloody Mary. And then Anne Boleyn, even though regardless of everything that happened with her, she was actually the one that kind of was the influence to him wanting to do the Church of England. And she then, of course, gives him the child of the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth. So every wife had a part to play throughout this. So I found that very, very interesting. And again, but I do love Katherine Parr the most because at least she was able to be, at least evidence shows us, a wonderful stepmother to both his 2 daughters and make them feel like welcome. A lot of the wives that were displayed on the show, the Tudors, they kind of threatened, like for example, Jane Seymour, she was made to be much younger than his very first daughter, for example. So imagine how she felt, if that's accurate though. But that's how it is portrayed in the TV show. So the entire plot, like I said, it literally is all about King Henry VIII, his wives, his children, and all the different like things that he goes through with like Rome and Catholic faith, Protestant faith, Church of England, all these different things. And you really start to see in this show too, like what it means to really have a status as a boy or as a girl. And of course, like after he dies, the succession actually goes to his son anyway. And really his son didn't really have the power because his son wasn't even mature enough at that point yet. But it's crazy how like it goes to the boy who is way younger than both of his daughters. And really, it should have went to just Mary altogether. But hey, she's the eldest. But of course, in that time frame, that would never happen. So again, he's known for, again, all his wives, his romanticism. And it's crazy because all these wives that he had, it did a big reflect on the politics that he dealt with in England at the time. And the show was created by Michael Hurst. The show had to eventually, of course, come to an end because it really did explain the story of how his 9-year-old son succeeded, and he actually dies 6 years later. Of course, then becomes the King of England and Ireland after King Henry VIII is dead. And he's raised as a Protestant. His sister is Mary I, known as Bloody Mary. She tried to bring England back to the church. In doing so, she burned a lot of people to bring back the Catholic faith. And she was actually married to Philip II of Spain. So again, this is where history goes in again. And then after she is queen, after her younger brother dies again, then she dies. And then we have Elizabeth I, Queen of England and Ireland. And she's also known as the famous Virgin Queen. She is the last of the House of Tudor. So she ends it because she never had any kids. And as they said, she never had sex either. But there's this TV show called Reign that actually explains further more about what was happening at the time with the Queen of England, which is the Virgin Queen. And of course, many of you probably seen so many movies about the Virgin Queen as well, how she did have lovers and stuff like that, and a very specific one, but again, never had any children. And this is where also in Reign, where the Virgin Queen is actually the cousin of Mary, Queen of Scots, which they also explain as well in Reign. And it's funny because Mary, Queen of Scots, even though she is basically kind of at war with the Queen of England because they both have legitimacy to the throne of England. But at that point in time, Mary was actually married to King Francis. So she had power over France and Scotland. And if she really wanted to, she could have had power over England as well. And that's where the feud was. But later on throughout the years, after Elizabeth I dies, then we have Mary's son with Lord Stanley. He actually becomes King of Scotland, England, and Ireland. This is pretty cool because it's kind of like ironic, you know. So again, this is like things, again, that happened, you know, throughout the timeline and everything like that. And of course, those events happened like later on. But coming up after the break, we'll finally get into the one and only The Spanish Princess, which again, we'll talk about the prequels of King Henry VIII. You don't want to miss it.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
All right, everyone, welcome back from the break. We're coming to a close to our show. I hope everyone has enjoyed the episode so far. I hope you've been intrigued by all the facts and the Monarchs. So if you're now tuning in, we just finished discussing about King Henry VIII, his TV show called The Tudors, which you can actually watch on Netflix. I believe it has about 7 or 8 seasons. We're now finally going to get into the prequel of his life when it first started out, before he actually became king and when he was about to become king, etc., etc. So I have to admit, though, when I first watched The Tudors, I didn't realize who his first wife was, but finally when they came into the Spanish Princess, which they actually called the TV show the last installment to when they started the White Queen, the White Princess, and now the Spanish Princess. So again, the way you would watch all shows is you will leave the Tudors for last, because these top 3 shows are the prequels before you would watch the Tudors over again, if you've watched it before. And you will watch the White Queen, the White Princess, and then the Spanish Princess. It all literally follows in place for the timeline. So the way season 1 starts off for the Spanish Princess is we finally are introduced to who Katherine of Aragon really is and who her parents are, which again I mentioned a little bit earlier in the show. We have Ferdinand II and Isabel of Castile I. So this show is very important because it explains her bloodline, and she was the mother of Bloody Mary. She actually was also the first female ambassador in history. And again, before she was married to King Henry VIII, she was actually married to his older brother, to Arthur, Prince of Wales, who died 5 months later, and basically within their first year of marriage. But it was never consummated, which is why she was able to marry King Henry VIII. But later on, this whole conspiracy happens where King Henry VIII felt like she did have sex with him and wasn't a virgin when they were married. So he was able to finally annul and divorce their marriage. Then she also played as regent of England while King Henry VIII was fighting in France. So in season 2, we're definitely going to see the wedding and when they have the coronation of him being king and queen. King Henry, however, is already claimed king in the first season of The Spanish Princess, because his father we actually witness King Henry VII dying in The Spanish Princess show. It's weird. I don't know if this is accurate or not, but like his father actually tried marrying the Queen Katherine before King Henry VIII could actually get to her, because he actually didn't agree with the marriage. Elizabeth of York actually did not agree with the marriage either in the TV show. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not, but it would kind of make sense if the events that happened on the TV show were actually true events, the way they described it, at least that one part. So, and then I think, honestly, from my perspective, I think it's because too, like, the way the show portrayed it, because she was already married to one of the brothers, so her marrying to the other brother, they kind of looked at her like, all right, they kind of slut-shamed her, unfortunately. And during this time too, this is also when Christopher Columbus comes to rise, because you may have noticed Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabel of Castile, they are the king and queen of Spain that kind of like employed Christopher Columbus to start off like seeing other parts of the New World to be claimed. So this is during this era. And Christopher Columbus actually is in the first part of Spanish Princess. So I'm not sure I'm hoping that they do that again too, because there's a lot of controversy, especially with people like Christopher Columbus, like him claiming that he found parts of America and all these different things. Of course, in my opinion, I do not agree with that, because the Vikings were actually one of the first few people to do that. And then on top of that too, Native Americans were already living here, people, so you should actually be giving the claim to them. So yeah, he was basically reporting back to them, of what he found and stuff like that, as you know, throughout history. And again, they had many kids as well, like Queen Katherine of Aragon, her sister, I believe is Joanna. She actually is known as the Mad, but we'll get more into that later. So throughout season 2, so far in the trailer, we start to see how Katherine is having trouble getting pregnant, because as soon as they get married, King Henry's all about producing heirs, of course. And it explains what is happening, again, in other countries at the time. Like I said before, Finding America. She, this also explains, too, why, if you watch the Tudors TV show, why she looks much older in the Tudors. Because, again, they were married at a very young age, like around 17, 19 years old. So, at this point in time, you know, this is literally the beginning of the beginning of their love. So she gave no sons to Henry, and there was rumors flying around that she was never really a virgin. And in the TV show too, like, Henry had sex with her older sister, and the way, now it may be inaccurate or accurate, but the way it was portrayed, they wanted to show you in the first season how she was lying about the marriage between her and his older brother, and no one believed her that they did not consummate the marriage. The way it was portrayed in, like, the very first season, there was a point in time, a scene where you thought they were having sex, but I guess they weren't. So it's really hard to explain. And then King Henry, of course, he is shown to, like, be a manipulator and a liar when he lies to her face in, like, the last episode of season 1 that he never had sex with the sister. So already you're just like, they did all this work in the first season to be together after a while, but then and everyone was trying to split them apart. But then, of course, their marriage and their relationship starts off on a lie. So it's just crazy. And of course, Katherine never agreed with him going to war with France at this point in time. And we see that in the trailer as well. And Katherine was supposed to be with Henry, the older brother who died. She was already married to him, but it was never consummated. But apparently they did not have sex. So, and it's crazy because I feel like with all these 3 shows, the family of York was killed so that way the Tudors could reign. Because York is basically not mentioned at all at this point. We're starting new heirs. We're starting new legitimacy. So in season 2, again, it premieres October 11th. Of course, we will have the wedding, the pregnancy, the war in Scotland and France. It's all about young lovers. We definitely are going to see the famous speech from Katherine, who is basically trying to uplift the English soldiers during a fight that happened in England. And again, she was one of the only women that Henry really loved. Then going into her sister now is Juana la Loca, the Mad. She is very important because she could not rule due to the men in her life. And the only reason why her older sister became the queen of Aragon and Castile was because of her father's throne. And then Isabel of Castile, which is both their mother, she actually dies. But the way the mother did it was she actually gave the throne to her on her deathbed because their older brother and their older sister, the older brother actually, his name is Juan, he dies of an illness, and then the sister that was older than both of them, which is why they didn't go to her, she actually dies in childbirth. So it didn't work out for the 2 older siblings. So then we're left with Juana and Katherine, and basically her husband was Philip the Faithful, but he was never really faithful. At least that's how it is portrayed in the show. And her father was still alive, Ferdinand II. But her father actually wanted to be the one to actually control Castile, which was his wife's territory. So even though they ruled Spain together, Ferdinand II and Isabel of Castile, they actually were, like, say, for example, Isabel of Castile could not have any power over Aragon because that was her husband's area, and vice versa. So she actually was one of the queens where it's like, no, this is mine. You can't take it from me, even though I'm married to you. It didn't work that way for Juana because Isabel of Castile said that until she's able to produce an heir, and he would actually become the heir to that territory, to Castile. But at the time, her father would have had to been regent. So, of course, then her husband wants the power, too, that she's married to, because he feels like, well, I'm married to her, so that should be my property. So then we have, again, they had 6 children. They all became kings and queens, of course, in their own right, between the countries of Portugal, France, Spain, and Denmark, and Hungary. You see how power goes here? Her husband cheated on her many times, and they call her the Mad because apparently she went into like fits and rages and depression because of that. The ironic thing is how he is called Philip the Faithful, but he should be called Philip the Unfaithful. So Juana became, again, heir to Castile and Aragon, but as I said before, she never really got to rule because of her husband and her father. And again, this kind of affects the relationship between her and Catherine of Aragon, because even though Catherine was queen, again, as a woman, you really didn't have much influence and much say-so. But King Henry VIII respected her as as a good king and a good husband, because she was the one wife where it was like, if you told her what to do, she'll do it based on what her husband is. Because back then, it's all about obeying your husband. We don't really use those terms now, because it's more like the husband kind of controls the wife, because he's the head of the house, so he's the head of the family, he's the head of the royal family. So that's just how it works, back then. And again, if you really want to get into the understanding of the show, I would recommend watching season 1 and then, of course, season 2 on October 11th when it premieres. But before watching The Spanish Princess, you will have a better understanding if you watch The White Queen and The White Princess, because you start to see where things started, where things escalated, where things de-escalated, and why it makes sense to watch The Spanish Princess before watching The Tudors. I wouldn't dive right into it because, again, where The Tudors comes off, at this point in time, Catherine and they basically weren't moving like a married couple anymore. He was already at this point having sex with other women. I mean, he probably was doing it throughout their entire marriage anyway. There was a point in time, again, where they did love each other and they did want to be together, and where he was still hopeful that she may have sons, so that way they can have heirs to the throne. Of course, not daughters, but sons. So again, thank you for listening to Monarchs and Facts and History today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Again, you can watch all 4 of these shows right now if you really wanted to. White Queen, The White Princess is on Starz, The Tudors is on Netflix, and The Spanish Princess is also on Starz, okay? So go ahead and watch that before you go back and rewatch The Tudors, or if you never watched it before, you definitely leave that for last. Thank you for listening to the GSMC TV show podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts podcast network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts podcast network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.